So what's it going to be? It's Thanksgiving. Sweet potato pie?
Yes.
Pumpkin pie?
Yes.
Pecan pie? And it's not pecan? Right? I've been told that now. I've been corrected. So you've been keeping up, right? Patty LaBelle has a recipe out there. Stores are selling out of the pie. So how many? Let's show a hand. Sweet potato pie. All right. How many of you never tried it before? Oh, really? A bunch of you have tried it. All right. Pecan. See, there I went. She's always correcting me. Pecan. Pumpkin.
Yes.
All right. It's almost a split between pecan and pumpkin. All right. Here's where the rubber hits the road. Minced meat. This is like alien. All right. And apple cinnamon. There's all sorts of options. I realize that. We haven't gotten this. Clearly, we're not creative enough. All of the above is the best option. So here's where the rubber hits the road then, because this is always in my family's households. Historically, it's been the case. What kind of dressing? Bread, cornbread, sage, oyster. Look at their faces. How many for sage?
All of it.
How many for the cornbread? Wow, this is cornbread country. How many for the oyster? Really? All right. It's a few brave folks for oyster. And then, of course, what was that? Stovetop. Stovetop. That's true. That's a tradition in a lot of households. And then you could get all sorts of creative with cranberries and apples and such. But Thanksgiving is one of those times of years that it's, as we were in Europe for the past couple of weeks, and I should dispel any myths, the reason why I was there with Linda was because every trip that Linda has ever taken a church group over to either the Middle East or some other educational opportunities trip, I've been elsewhere, and this was a trip that she arranged a year ago prior to her taking a leave of absence or a renewal leave, and then also prior to the fact that she got severely sick, like for 10 days right up to the time that we left. So I was lined up to go on this trip for some time, and because that was also an educational thing, I actually went along. We were going up and down the Rhine River in Germany, France, Switzerland, and Amsterdam, and so I told Grimm's fairy tales while we were traveling along. So while we were looking at the Reformation and people of faith, I was also reminding them of Grimm's fairy tales. So it was a nice balance to the whole experience. But one of the things that was clearly not present there was this idea of Thanksgiving. It's not a tradition there. So what was beginning was, of course, the beginning festivities for the Feast of St. Stephen and for Christmas season. And so villages are being set up all over the place. Every single village in town is just laden with temporary wooden structures that are covered with trolls and elves and pine trees and wreaths and just amazing sort of transformation of the towns. That's all changing, of course, because of what's happened in France most recently. So I'll mention that in a moment. But the idea of Thanksgiving is one of these perennial sort of things that we have an ideal created around it. In fact, we even enacted in schools to this day. Elementary schools play out the drama, the Pilgrims, the first Native American Pilgrim gathering in the early 1600s, around 1623. This first meal, this idyllic sort of sharing in spite of the ironies of the situation and the realities of what's present at that time. There's this idea of Thanksgiving. Now, for me, Thanksgiving was always at my grandmother's house, and it's a place that I enjoyed going, but it was that unstructured time that we had that was always the most challenging. Today we call it boredom. Back then it was just do whatever you can, create whatever mischief you can. And I was never bored because I always tried to avoid the boredom, but I want to say that I have been bored before. I've told you all stories about having to sit through my grandmother's operas when I was growing up as a kid, because my grandmother sang in the opera locally, and that was challenging when it was sung in a different language and such. And I've been to a few sermons where the fact is I would have fallen asleep if it hadn't been that I was the one who was speaking. I've been bored in that sense, but I try to avoid boredom in all situations, even some of the most tedious lectures. I find myself like Lori back here, who's drawing and creating wonderful art pieces, which will someday be a devotional that we'll publish. But, or making notes, or finding myself doing what my kids have done, sometimes in with me, but other times with other ministers, where they play sort of what they call a sermon bingo. And how many times will he say this word? And they sit next to each other and they mark out the words as I speak. And they've done this with other ministers who are far more consistent in their language than even I am. But there were these aphorisms that I left from Thanksgiving that I will give to you, because they've always stayed in my mind, and we still repeat them around the dinner table sometimes when we gather with my mother and some of the other family brothers and sisters. One of them that my uncle used to always say was, after looking at this feast, he would almost say, at the beginning, as we're sitting down, he says, look at this, if you leave here hungry, it's your own fault. And then my grandmother would always say, if you don't see it on the table, it's not important. My uncle would look at the cranberry sauce and say, Thanksgiving's invitation to adventure, which we never endured. We never partook. And then my favorite one was this, his usual Zen sort of style, which was, don't ask for what you don't see. It's good training for later in life. There are expectations and norms around the way that life is supposed to be, and so that's true for Thanksgiving. More of our personal realities, however, suggest the opposite. Life isn't often ideal. The gatherings aren't going to be there for all of us. Things have changed in our families. Some of our families don't get along with each other, and we haven't gotten together in years. It's true for my own family. One side is completely connected. The other side, pretty much divided. It's a reality that things aren't ideal in the way in which our norms present them in our culture. And then we add to that the things that happened in Paris this last week, and also the bombings in Mali, and we realize that life isn't idyllic by any stretch of the imagination. And if you walk through any of the tents out here, today is also Social Justice or Justice Ministry Sunday, and we have a very active and strong program in justice ministry here at the church, with many of the monies you bring and offer go to that ministry as well as others, helping children in abusive situations, women and mothers in abusive realities. And you could just look at the numbers out there. And again, we realize that the ideals which we portray in the media, which we sort of hold up in our own iconic understanding of life in America, really don't always match up with the way life is. And it reminded me of a story that I wanted to use today as sort of a foundation for us to think about this text, all things. This was the Message version of that familiar text from Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love the Lord. And it's one of those things that as I traveled around even, I heard our bishop, not our bishop, but Bishop White, who was a retired bishop from another conference, who was giving lectures on the ship, who would always end every discussion, every presentation with God is good all the time, God is good. Maybe you've been in a Methodist church where that's been recited. And you have to sometimes sit back and think in the context of Paris or the context of Mali or the context of our own realities, how discordant that can sound, how dissonant that can sound at times. How in the world is that even possible? What can that possibly mean? And this is a story that we've told in here before. It's one of my favorite little Zen stories, but I think it gives us some groundwork perhaps. The farmer who once had a horse that ran off, and the neighbors came to him and said, how sad for you because you've lost your horse. I mean, this is your primary mode of work, of transportation, of tilling in the fields, and now you've lost your horse. And the farmer just looked at his neighbors and smiled and said, who knows? It may be bad or it may be good. And then the next day, when the horse suddenly reappeared, there was a brand new horse with it, a stallion that had followed it back. And now he had two horses, where before he thought he'd lost the one. And the neighbors came up to him, and this time congratulating him, but perhaps a little jealous at his good fortune. And they said, well, lucky for you. Isn't this great? Your horse came back and brought a second horse. You must be really excited. And he said, who knows? It may be bad. It may be good. Who knows? And then a few weeks later, his son was breaking in that new stallion and was thrown from the horse and broke his leg. And the neighbors all heard about it, and there he was all strapped up with a stick and couldn't hardly move. And they realized, well, here was another part of his labor force, and how is he going to break in the horse without the son? And they said, how terrible for you. I mean, your son's broken his leg. Who knows if he'll even walk again, much less work in the near future for the harvesting. It's terrible. And again, the farmer said, who knows? May be bad, it may be good. Who can say? A few weeks later, that region joined with other regions within the country in China, and they went to war. And all of the young able-bodied men, of course, were conscripted. And as the men were marching off to battle, the neighbors watched their own sons disappear off into the hillside, and they looked back at the farmer and his son there with his crutch and his leg all bandaged up, and this time a little more angry, a little more bitter as they watched their own sons. And they said, well, you must be really happy. You must be really satisfied that this worked out this way for you. Good for you. And he simply smiled and said, who knows? May be bad, it may be good. When we read this text from Romans 28, I think to myself, what is this really saying? All things work together for good. Because good is such a relative term, is it not? When we went on this trip, there was one of our travelers, and some of you might know him. Bill and Catherine Hunn Bill is an older member in our congregation. I didn't ask permission to tell this story, so hopefully he won't mind too much. I don't think he'll mind too much if I tell it. He told this story as we were on the ship, and Linda and I just didn't know this about Bill. He's such an interesting person. I think some of it came about because most of our cathedrals that we saw were all Catholic cathedrals, and Bill grew up in New York Catholicism and always would smile and say, all I remember are mean nuns with rulers. And he said, I can't think of a whole lot of positive experiences I had as a child growing up in New York in that particular Catholic parish that he grew up in. But we were talking about his history there and how his grandmother came over from England. And he told this story about how in April in I'm going to forget the date, but 1912 or 13, I forget the exact date, but she was to come over on the ship to America where some of her other family had already gathered and was going to move to the United States. But her paperwork was not right. There was some wrong stuff with the paperwork, and she had to go back and get some of it redone. So she missed the ship. And then about 2 or 3 days later, after getting the paperwork done, she was able to get on board the next ship that went over. That second ship, around 3 days later, had come across hundreds of people in life rafts that were floating, barely surviving. And her ship and the crew and most of the members spent a full day helping them on board and rescuing what was left over from the Titanic, the ship that she was supposed to have been on. Now, his grandmother's story certainly isn't the only story in that case. There were a number of people who should have been on that ship, but for some reason weren't. And we've heard stories like this all the time, but Bill smiled and he says, my grandmother, he said, suffered for the longest time this deep, terrible sense of guilt, which is not unusual, the survivor's guilt that you might have heard of. How do you reconcile this idea that God spared me, but didn't spare the other thousands? How do we reconcile that God spared those that were in Paris, but not the 129 that died? Or those in Bali that weren't killed by the bombers? How do we reconcile this idea? What kind of God is selective? Or do we just relax with the idea that we just don't know? To be honest with you, I think it's a difficult question. It's one of the questions I struggle with all the time. And to be honest with you, I don't have an answer. I have lots of things I'd like to think, but I don't have an answer. What I think I have may be a direction. And part of it, I think, came from some of the good fortune I had on this trip. I gave you this title, Thanksgiving. Oh, wow, I just saw that picture. That's an awesome picture. I had not seen that. I took this title, Loving What We Don't Like, in a sense because I wanted it to provoke this idea. How do we love what we don't like? That's really a challenge. And when I say that, sometimes I think we're apt to go to this idea of, well, I'm in an abusive relationship. I just have to learn to love it. I just have to learn to like where I am right now. It's much deeper than that. Our tendency is to be thankful for what we have. And I don't want to disabuse us of that opportunity. There's absolutely nothing wrong to be thankful for what we have. But there is something to be said for learning to be thankful that doesn't matter upon what we have or don't have. And that's where I think sometimes we have to get out of our Western minds because we live in a fairly prosperous reality. And even if we don't have that prosperity ourselves, the reality around us is constantly reminding us, those who have and those who don't. We live in a world that says thankfulness sometimes is dependent on what we have. So I gave this little title just to hopefully to kind of provoke this idea of maybe there's another way to look at this, to turn it upside down. I read something here recently on a blog on how to find happiness, and it was interesting what the individual said. He said, number one, there were all these other great things. Learn to be present, learn to practice an awareness of others, learn to engage in being charitable and compassionate with others. But this one person had this interesting idea that I'm still wrestling with in my head. He said, number one thing, how to be happy, get rid of all the cognitive dissonance in your life. Now, that's a tricky phrase. I'm more familiar with it because I studied psychology. And I had to learn a lot what that is. And nowadays, I see it all the time in me and in everybody else I'm with. I see this idea in which we live with things that we know we shouldn't. Sharm mentioned in her sermon a couple of weeks ago, you mentioned that verse from Paul, where Paul talks about, I do the things I ought not to do, and I don't do the things I ought to do. And Paul sort of gave it up to the vagaries of the flesh, sort of the evils of the flesh. And so I just need to focus more on God. He just didn't understand the idea of cognitive dissonance, which is basically we make up excuses for what's familiar, even if what's familiar is wrong. Even if what we do is what we know we ought not to do. So we smoke cigarettes even though we know cigarettes will kill us. We do certain practices even though we know these practices will harm us in the long run. If we were to face a dire situation where it was life or death, we wouldn't give it a second thought. We would respond to the crises in every way possible to preserve life or to perpetuate life or to save or help someone. But when it comes to our own lifestyle and practices and sort of habits, we live these things because we come up with ways of trying to understand them or justify them, even though in reality they're somewhat self-destructive. We do it all the time with everything. And sometimes we do it in ways that are almost ironic if we were to step out and look at it like a soap opera and we go, really? You're doing that? Didn't you just realize you were at Anne Frank's house? You remember the suffering she went through and now you're complaining about which bin your baggage went into? Really? But of course, we don't sit back and think about the bigger picture. We live out the ironies day after day. And that's where I think learning to love what we don't like becomes a way of practice. A number of us, I was telling John Fortman just before the service began, that I haven't traveled in a long time. I used to travel all the time, right? Some of you travel for business, so you travel all the time. And maybe you recognize this reality. There's sort of travel in the beginning is kind of an adventure. It's kind of exciting. It's kind of, where do I put my bag here? I'm worried about that. Let me go ahead and sign up the green tag just in case. We get all anxious about things, and then we hold on to the seat, and we're flying, and we're just wondering, and it's wonderful. And then we've been accustomed to it, and we're veterans, and it's like looking down at all the seats and seeing 130 bubbles. And everybody's in their bubble. And everybody's just getting from one place to the next place. Completely the opposite of being somewhere like on a river cruise or perhaps in Anne Frank's house, where now we're trying to be present to this strangeness. The challenge, I think, sometimes in gratitude is learning how to be present to the strangeness every day. even when it seems normal. Because what happens when it becomes familiar is some of our worst side kind of comes out. Some of that, what I wish I wasn't doing, comes out all the time, and we don't even give it a second thought. So that on the trip going back, after we're all been to Anne Frank's house and we're all getting on the bus, and then we're getting into the airport, and then onto the plane, there's all this anxiety, getting to the flight, getting on the board, making sure that we get in our seat, first come, first serve, gets the bins above, right? And we're all anxious about making sure our carry-on gets on. And so next thing you know is that the people that are in the back of the plane have put all their stuff in the front of the plane, right? Anybody commiserating with me here? Anybody going like, yeah, that's just wrong? That's me. That was me. I went in there and I was like, whose bag is this? This is my seat. And then I looked 5 rows back and the guy says, don't touch my bag. And I'm like, but it's over my seat. And so I'm complaining, and he's complaining, and then I stop and I realize, wait a second, this is completely, I apologized to him, and I said, you know what, you're right, this is your bag. I need to put my bag somewhere. Would it be possible if I moved my bag and moved your bag and put it back one? There's a space right here closer to your space, and then I'll put my bag, would that be, okay? And he says, don't touch my bag. Okay, that's fine. So I just live with it. But the reality was that this guy was traveling with me on the boat. And we'd both done the tour through Anne Frank's house. But we suddenly forgot who each other was because we're back in the familiar mode of our protectivism, of our egos, of our fears. And that's where we often spend our life, right, is in our fears. And it prevents us sometimes from discovering the strangeness and wonder of just the average moment. I want to share a quick story here from something that happened to me that I think gives us a little idea about the direction. Because I think it's a hard question to answer. How do we give thanks in the midst of fear or in the midst of anxiety or in the midst of pain or terror? How do we give thanks in the midst of loss, in the midst of disappointment? Now, Lynn Deloney is not in here, I don't think. Is he? I saw him earlier. Lynn had told me on this trip, because I told him that the bishop was going to be speaking about women of faith. Well, actually, he was talking about his mother and other women of his faith growing up. And I might share some stories from that. It was fascinating later on in the Advent season. But one of the things that Lynn said, well, you're on the Rhine River. Then surely he's going to talk about Hildegard von Bingen. And Hildegard von Bingen is 11th century mystic, just an amazing woman who many people say, if you look all the way back and follow the trace of her life, was probably sort of the progenitor of women's movement. She was an outspoken, politically active mystic who had visions, who practiced deep compassion, who was probably the forethought of Meister Eckhart and Matthew Fox and the whole creation spirituality, who was just a deeply spiritual person, and a beautiful young woman who, after having this first vision, entered into monastic life in the Benedictine order. Well, her abbey is right there on the river, and I said, well, we're not stopping. We're not stopping. Major woman in the Christian faith, we're not stopping. We're passing for the nearest castle down the way. Beautiful, beautiful vineyards there. Wonderful music shop where all the mechanical musical instruments perform for you. And a big cathedral again. And Bill's going like, not another Catholic church. And so and he's saying, and then the bishop's not even talking about Hildegard. Well, we stopped at a place called, and I'm going to get the name wrong, Rudesheim. It's a beautiful village on the river. We pull over, and they're going to take us in to see the museum. And I climb up to the deck on top to look around, and I see an abbey at the top of the hill. So go ahead and show a picture, the next picture there. I see this at the top of the hill above the city, above the town. Now, it's much smaller because it's about 8 miles away, but it's way up at the top of the hill. And so I go up on top of the deck, and I ask the cruise director, what is that? And he says, I don't know, it's another church. And I said, well, I know that there's this person, Hildegard von Bingen, that grew up here and started her abbey in this area. And so he gets on his Google, and he's looking at it, and he says, well, what do you know? This is Eibingen Abbey, and this is Hildegard's Abbey. It's right there at the top of the hill. It's one of two. The other one is in Bingen on the other side of the river where we weren't stopping. So they all got in their bus, and they went to that, and I got a bike, and I rode up the hill. And I went up the top of the hill. You can keep showing some pictures here real quick as I just show you a little slideshow. You keep on going. It's beautiful. It's massive. This is just the front part of it and the church. This particular thing was built in the 13th century or 14th century, and maybe a little bit further. And there's a picture of her statue, unfortunately a little shadowed here, looking off in the early morning, and at the cities down below. We're probably about maybe 1,000 feet up above the city. It took about an hour to ride a little 3-speed up the hill to get there. But when I got up there, I went into, that's looking at it through the vineyards. By the way, the place is surrounded by vineyards. Guess what the nuns grow? They make some award-winning wine. So I walked up there, and I don't, what's the next one? Does the next one show the chapel? I may not have put the chapel in there. Okay, that's the chapel inside there. I went in the chapel. There were a couple of sisters who were praying at the inn, and it's a huge chapel. I went into the gift shop. There were 5 sisters, 5 nuns there who were cleaning and setting things up. It's about 9:30 in the morning, and there was a little bar area, I don't know, counter area, with some wine bottles and some tasting glasses. And so I guess, well, I found out that they grow their own wine. They have the Hildegard vineyards. And so I walked up to one of the nuns, and I said, so you have your wine? And she said, yes. She said, would you like to taste some? And I thought, well, of course I would. And so I said, sure. And so she sampled 3 or 4, and I said, which one is this? And she said, after we got to talking for a minute, she said, well, I don't know which one this is. And I said, well, it's not busy. There's nobody here. Is this because of the bombings and the terror activity had happened literally the day before? And she said, no. She said, this is just kind of an off season. There'll be folks here in a few hours, maybe sooner, but it was kind of quiet for the first hour or two. And I said, so what wine is this? And she said, well, I don't know. And I kid you not, she looked around for a second, and she said, I'll try it and tell you. And so she poured a little wine into it, and she said, this is the one that's supposed to be our award-winning. And so she had actually 2 little samples of wine with me, and there I was drinking with this nun, which I thought was just the perfect setting, at the top of the village at Hildegard's Abbey while everybody else was out at the music store. And we just got into this wonderful conversation because I didn't know much about Hildegard. And we sampled the wines, and I ended up buying a few bottles of wine, and so I have several. If you're interested, I'd be happy to share. But also a great tonic for indigestion. It's 40 proof. So we're going to go there very limitedly. But I asked her this question about how she felt about what was going on. And this is what I want to end with, that I thought was fascinating, what she said to me. Because I wasn't aware of what Hildegard's practices were or her beliefs, other than I knew she had this influence on Matthew Fox and Meister Eckhart and stuff. And I said to her, so about all of this, I said, are you concerned about this fear that's in the country right now? And she said, she's not afraid of it at all. And I said, and then I kind of laughed, and I said, why? And by that point, we had some other folks that had started showing up, and they were making jokes with her, saying like, well, the wine kind of calms any kind of fear, right? And she said, oh, no. She said, that's not it at all. And this is what I thought was fascinating. She said, we prepare for fear every day. I thought, what? She said, we prepare for fear every day. She said, the world is filled with terror. Our own hearts are filled with anger and hatred. We're not immune to that, she said, pointing to herself and nuns and pointing to me. We're not immune to that, our envy and our egoism. So we prepare for the terror every day by waking up in the dark of the morning and offering prayers of thanksgiving for darkness. Not for the light to come, she said, but for the darkness we live in, so that we might prepare for the light. She said, and then as the light arrives, we welcome the surprise. And she said, she stopped for a moment, and she said, we're not being thankful for what we have, like I think people in America do on Thanksgiving. She said, we're praying to learn how to be grateful, how to love what we don't like or what we are afraid of. And then she said, she said this to the guy that had said that about the wine. She said, it's not the wine that calms our fears, and this is what I think is where our direction might be. She said, it's gratitude for the love that creates the grapes and the vine that holds the grapes together. While the sun gives life to the grape, it's gratitude and thankfulness for our connection to what gives life. And to those who love, as well as to those who hate, that's what makes the wine calming. It's not the alcohol, it's the love that goes into the creation of it. She said, if you think about creation, it has no prejudice. It simply creates. Creation is filled with gratitude and opportunity and love, and what dies must die, and what dies gives new life. She said, the only way to really prepare for terror is to participate in life. I thought that was fascinating. How do we conquer fear? There's that text in the scripture, and I'm forgetting where it is now, and maybe Sean remembers where it is. Love, perfect love, casts out all fear. And I've often struggled with what does this mean to love God so that all things work together for good. And I think the nuns at Hildegard von Bingen have it down. And that Alfred North Whitehead, who was sort of our founder of process theology, often said, all of life, if you look at it, is really moving towards what is good. All of life moves towards creating, towards creation. We're sometimes the one that step in the way. So what the nuns reminded me, and maybe where the direction is that even in the midst of things that aren't going the way we expect them to, that what God calls us to do is to participate in giving life in every opportunity we have. To live thankfully is not to be thankful for what we have, but it's to be creatively involved in what is yet to be created. Amen.